It was so bold and unapologetic and hopefully very, very funny. In fact, they fairly bursting with jokes. A cult classic in record time, just 12 episodes. Fawlty Towers not only broke boundaries, but it taunted them, marched past them, and then tripped over them with a smirk on its face. But somewhere in the midst of the mayhem, there was a scene that crossed the line which would never uncrossed. So, what exactly was in that moment that led to a show that was seemingly so quiet about some issues, yet wanted to utilize its disappearance? Stick around for our look at the circumstances leading to the downfall of Fawlty Towers. The Real Hotel. The Real Hotel horror that sparked a comedy legend. It was intended to be just another stop-on. Crash, nothing fancy, just a decent hotel in a sleepy seaside town. The year was 1970, and the Pythons had descended upon Torquay to make their flying circus series. But what they found instead wasn't just accommodation. It was a surreal, borderline absurd lesson in how every morning I go to a small, not to run a hotel. And for John Cleese, it was the birthplace of one of British television's most classic disasters, Basil Fawlty. Now, just suppose the following. You enter a hotel after a long journey, looking forward to some rest. Instead, you're greeted by a man who's so suspicious and aggressive, you start to wonder if you're being secretly filmed. That was Donald Sinclair, one of the Sinclair brothers, the manager of the Gleneagles Hotel in the real world, able to merge paranoia and customer service. Were to go hand in hand. He wasn't just rude. This is a man who could be erratic on purpose. He could be They much liked the invaders and interrogated their every action, as if they were all planning against him. The moment that had left the Pythons in a state of stunned disbelief, Eric Idle had briefly left his chair. Briefcase left there in the lobby. Rather than doing what any rational hotel owner would do, which would be to politely inquire as to who this briefcase belonged to, Sinclair, assuming the worst, without hesitation, he grabbed the case and hurled it over a garden wall because they were sure it was a bomb. Not exactly a warm welcome, and definitely not the sort of security you'd like to see from a hospitality consultant. However, this was not an isolated occurrence. When Gilliam was using his knife and fork the wrong way, Sinclair stormed off to straighten him out on his table manners as if poor Gilliam did not know any better. Sinclair was becoming increasingly the use of fork and knife in eating meals were a criminal offense. Guest complaints regarding open contempt. Sinclair escalated the difficulties instead of solving them, and he promoted an environment that was as comically unbearable as it was real. John Cleese was baffled and amused. This man, he recalled thinking, is talking about man so impossibly wrong for the job, so unintentionally ridiculous, that Cleese. I just thought he was one of the most entertaining guys to watch play baseball that year, he said, laughing. You didn't. In a disaster class for hospitality, as recorded by John Cleese in Sinclair's class, and it carried over, together with his then-wife, co-writer Connie Booth, all that madness would somehow funnel into a figure destined to remain a legend on television. Basil Fawlty, and the fantastically inept hotel manager of the notorious Fawlty Towers, was born not out of fiction, but out of this weird reality. Of course, Cleese exaggerated the quirks, the rages of Basil, the passively aggressive asides, and the rest. His failure to cope with stress became play-acted for comedic purposes. However, the essence of Basil is his suspect eye on social ineptness and ability to offend all parties, spawned full-blown out of. The series itself only had 12 episodes that aired between 1975 and 1979, but it left an impression which few comedies have. Each muddled confusion, each meltdown, behind the reception desk, sat a testament to the confounding experience in Torquay. Ironically, Sinclair also never fully understood the inspiration for the show he created. Sinclair died in the year 1981, seemed oblivious to the fact that his incompetent style of management had been commemorated in British comedy. While Fawlty Towers achieved legendary status, the true story about the origins of Fawlty Towers is completely different and highly unlikely. Remains stranger and funnier than fiction. It wasn't invented in a writer's room as an out-of-whole-cloth premise. It started with a serendipitous meeting in a place that nobody thought would remember, in a hotel that nobody thought would be mentioned. The subject of it all, on the other hand, thought he could control everything, including life. He was running a tight ship when, in fact, he was captaining the Titanic of customer service. However, for John Cleese, this was just the beginning. Before Fawlty Towers, before Basil, and before the accolades, how did his journey begin exactly? All will be revealed. The forming of John Cleese. From chaos to Cambridge, the making of John Cleese. Before there was the Monty Python madness and the even greater success of Basil Fawlty. The troubles of Fawlty's Hotel were being undertaken by John Cleese in the quiet seaside town of Weston-super-Mare. He came from a family that consisted of his father, Reginald Cleese, who was an insurance salesman and had a dislike by all concerned for the original family surname, Cheese. Feeling it much too foolish for an army man, Reginald formally swapped Cheese for Cleese in 1923, which would prove to join strange charm of his son's comedic legacy. At school, Cleese was greatly taller than his classmates literally. At 13, he was already over 6 feet tall. His awkward stature a source of notice before his sense of humor ever was. But behind the awkward height and the school uniforms, however, another thing was simmering. His education at St. Preparatory School, through a family inheritance, planted 2 vital seeds: a love of words and an observant eye for human behavior. He was more than just an intelligent boy who was succeeding. Cricket, boxing, he had already started studying the absurdity of life, though unwittingly. The classroom, however, was not sufficient to quench his curiosity. He once played a prank on a statue during his time at National High School. However, at Clifton College there were glimpses of the kind that would one day become the hallmark of Cleese's comedy style: dry, visual, and strangely cerebral. He depicted footprints leading away from a statue of sought refuge in a side street as if it had wandered off to the bathroom. Juvenile mischief, perhaps. However, this was still narrative in fast form. Not all of it was comedic, however. When Cleese found, at 17, that he had not been selected for a House Prefect position, although his academic achievements justified his candidacy, although later described simply as refused success, yet it has certainly impacted his life. This changed his perspective on what constitutes fairness and respect, something that would echo in the satirical perspective that he would ultimately apply to authority figures and institutions. With university places facing pressure because of the national service, Cleese had to put his plan to go to Cambridge a year behind schedule. Instead, he went to Brunel, to his alma mater, his old prep school, not as a pupil, but as a Latin, science, English, history educator. Ironically, Latin lessons given in his past would appear in Life of Brian *, in which Cleese's character is notorious for correcting the grammar of anti-Roman graffiti. Every odd detour in his the above path in some way got into his artistic toolbox. Later on, he staked a claim at Downing, the college, Cambridge, and law. However, other plans were in wait for me. During a student exhibition, was asked if he could sing or dance by the Footlights Theatre Club. No, said Cleese bluntly, adding that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. So what do you want, Leslie? You do, they asked. I make people laugh, he said. And that, quite literally, was his foot in the door. There, he met people he would work with in the future, including Tim Brooke-Taylor and Bill Oddie, and the man who would turn his world upside down, Graham Chapman. They met to start writing the kind of strange, cerebral, and anarchic comedy that would later come to transform British television. Nonetheless, despite his graduation with a law degree in 1963, Cleese's father is still sending him newspaper advertisements for retail management positions, and just in case the comedy thing didn't wake out. However, but one question lingers. How did this academically talented prankster schoolboy turn into a comedic powerhouse even before Fawlty Towers went on air? Wait and see to know. A brilliant mess of genius and marriage. Fawlty Towers, a brilliant mess of genius and marriage. If you ever wondered how a hotel run by a man on the brink of madness became one of some of the most loved sitcoms in British TV history, it wasn't because John Cleese had a solo stroke of genius. Instead, it all started with a marriage, not one intended to last a lifetime, but one that ignited creative magic. Cleese and then-wife Connie Booth drew from a real-life experientia. It became so hilariously disastrous that it remained memorable for years to come. The trouble began at a notorious stay at Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay, where Cleese found the hotel manager so ridiculously rude and incompetent that it bordered on satire. Most people would simply leave a bad review, but Cleese and Booth had a different idea, comedy gold. The idea of a short-fused hotel owner tangled in chaos refused to fade away, and soon the seeds of a story were planted in his mind regarding a hotel. Fawlties were introduced, but instead of simply depicting an irascible hotel owner as a standalone project, were honed every moment with wit, confusion, and characters so ridiculous they managed to feel real. When the series was first broadcast on the BBC in 1975, it didn't win the critics' hearts. One critic noted the series was a disaster, she said, baffled by the rapid-fire humor and illogical situations. No, the public got it. Audiences loved the frenetic vitality exuded by Basil Fawlty, the towering bundle of energy played by Cleese, of nerves and anger, together with the straight-shooting Sybil, the ever-practical Polly, and poor, hapless Manuel, who turned every misunderstanding into an explosive mess. It was this dynamic, rather than any sort of carefully choreographed narrative, that made, among all that slapstick mayhem, it was the clever timing and comedic tension that truly stood out. In every scene, every installment was a powder keg of confusion, pride, and repressed hysteria. Interestingly, for something so popular, the BBC almost pulled the plug after only 6 shows. But the rebroadcasts and the growing popularity by word of mouth caused the TV executives to have 4 years passed before the follow-up premiere of the second and final season of episodes. Only 12. They had never produced any episodes, and that doesn't mark this program's spot in television history. But backstage, the story wasn't as rosy at the time when the team of the series started filming the second series. However, the truth remains that Cleese and Booth were already divorced. Nevertheless, they continued with their collaboration in the creative department, mainly due to complete what they had started. It was to be the last collaboration of this partnership, but it had one final act to play. Something but bitter. Together, they drew the curtain on Fawlty Towers in style with their artistic chemistry, even if their marriage wasn't. Even today, years after the episode aired, the comedy in this series continues to fresh it's quoted, studied, and still watched by new generations who can't help but laugh at Basil's increasing rage or Manuel's innocent perplexity. Fawlty Towers showed that chaos, especially those that are the product of two people trying to transform a catastrophe into a comedy, can remain ageless, and somehow, through that mix of awkward hotel service, frayed nerves, but pure farce, Cleese and Booth gave the world a sitcom that never checked out. The genius of Fawlty Towers. The lasting genius of Fawlty Towers. Though there are May 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers, Fawlty Towers boasts a legacy that extends far beyond the short period of its existence, and the magic of Fawlty Towers lies here because when Fawlty Towers first aired in 1975, the reaction from television reviewers was one of puzzlement rather than pleasure. Some reviewed the show as chaotic and incoherent, unintelligent and incapable of understanding that all this mess was just the point. But, while critics held back, viewers locked in. They didn't just get it, they couldn't get enough of it. There was a painful reality to watching Basil Fawlty trying to cope with every day, convinced that he was in control of things while the universe had other ideas. John Cleese's The Comedy in the portrayal of Basil was only one aspect of a masterclass in the containment of rage and misplaced ambition. Basil wasn't bad or mean-souled by intention. Rather, he was merely tossed into a world of refinement he could never quite live up to. That inattention, his desperate desire to impress upwardly mobile patrons despite the fact that he himself is constitutionally unable to repress a showing of SN episodes into a ticking time bomb. But the real genius of Fawlty Towers wasn't the plot and the explosions. It was in the way it conveyed the ridiculousness and tragic elements within every collapse. Basil wasn't suffering alone. His sharp-tongued wife Sybil, played to perfection by Prunella Scales, just knew exactly how to deflate his ego with a single line. Polly, the intelligent maid played by Connie Saunders, was the epitome of intelligence. Think Booth, who was often the only grown-up in the whole building. Then there was Manuel, the lovable, hopelessly incompetent, eager-to-please waiters, played by the ever-confused Andrew Sachs, but every situation even more unmanageable, and every punchline more explosive. None of it was neat, and that was the point. The hotel's disasters were no isolated prank acts. They were extensions of Basil's inner mess. Underneath the slapstick, the show was examining class, insecurity, and human folly. Basil was so desperate to run a respectable business